of an edge. Just not long ago, the warning sirens began to wail on the Congress itself, and people were told to evacuate as quickly as they could. ABC's Linda Douglas, our Capitol Hill correspondent, was up there as well, and ABC's Cokie Roberts is also up there and was one of the people who was told, Cokie, just a short while ago to run.
That's true, Peter. The alarm went off and the police said, run, everybody out of here, everybody out of here. And we all went tearing down the steps, and we all meant former Vice President Quayle and his wife, Senator Kennedy, Senator McCain, Senator Graham. We all together, all of us, just tearing out of here with the police saying, faster, faster, go north, go north. And we, of course, didn't know which way was north. Finally, someone said, Union Station, go to Union Station. So we kept running, and finally they told us we could stop, and that they thought it was probably an all clear. But the sort of alarming thing is that the senators have BlackBerries, which are supposed to tell them when to evacuate. Those didn't work at all. They were never given an evacuation notice. They only got an all clear notice. And one amusing tidbit was while we were all running, the Secret Service was coming through here saying, where's Hillary? Where's Hillary? We have to get Hillary out, which didn't sit terribly well with some of her other Senate colleagues.
Well, thank you for that colorful description of what happened a short while ago. It was indeed a reminder of the fact that it is the Secret Service here that has the leading agency responsibility today, given the age in which we live. The alarm was apparently sounded when an aircraft, we believe belonging to Governor Ernie Fletcher of Kentucky, who was coming for the funeral ceremonies, was either in airspace which it shouldn't be, or perhaps was having trouble with its transponder. But it has come and gone as a very brief crisis, and we return now to this state funeral procession, this welcome to Washington, the city over which Ronald Reagan presided in such individual fashion so long. One of our guests today is our resident historian, Michael Beschloss. Michael, finish the phrase, if you will. Ronald Reagan returns to Washington.
Well, he returns to Washington, and when he came to Washington as president-elect, Peter, this was someone who had campaigned against Washington, said, I'm not part of the buddy system. But when he got here, one of the things he thought was that Jimmy Carter had been limited by not having very good relationships on Capitol Hill and with the permanent establishment here. And he had a party, Ronald Reagan did, with Mrs. Reagan at a club here with a lot of the people who were locals. And in his toast, he said, I'm aware of the fact that if you take the first letter off the word president, you get the word resident, and I intend to be a real resident of Washington.
The president's coffin, having come from California by air, will now be transferred from a hearse to this simple Army caisson, built in 1918. A caisson, simply a gun carriage, at least on the way to battle, and often used to bring the dead and wounded back from the battlefield. This particular one of two, built in 1918, just at the end of World War I, very simple black, and will be used as it has been used before to convey the president's casket up Constitution Avenue to the west side of the Capitol building. Sam Donaldson is there on the ellipse. Sam?
Peter, we're right opposite the south front of the White House. You can see it across the ellipse. The hearse, of course, is in position. As you pointed out, the caisson is ready. 6 matched horses bearing it. Riders on 3 of them on the left and riderless on the right. This is from a day when each member had 2 horses, one for himself and one for his provisions, and it harkens back to those days. Behind us, and I don't know whether you can see it in the shot yet, the Reagan family, Mrs. Reagan, waiting for the transfer of the casket to the caisson. This very interesting spot, Peter, the White House on one side, the Washington Monument on the other side. Right now, there's some fences around it because they're doing some construction for security purposes. But if you think about Washington with the Capitol on one end, Abraham Lincoln on the other, the White House on one side, and the Washington Monument on the other, this is the spot that says it all. Now they're transferring the casket. crowd, and here is Nancy Reagan coming forward.
Thank you, Mrs. Reagan. Mouse on the arm of the Army commander for the District of Washington, as she has been since she made her first public appearance at the Reagan Library in California a couple of days ago. Here again, a multi-service honor guard to transfer the president's casket, which is not light, 700, almost 800 pounds, from the hearse onto the caisson to go on up Constitution Avenue. And surely Mrs. Reagan will be immensely buoyed by this, again, very, very vocal expression of admiration from people just here today because, for one reason or another, they wanted to be here. This is a funeral today replete with all of, Sam Donaldson mentioned Lincoln Memorial off to our left as we look at the screen, and the Washington Monument on this side. Elements of this funeral taken from previous presidents, from previous state funerals, very much including President Lincoln's in 1865. It is here at the ellipse at 1600 Constitution Avenue, corresponding, of course, to Pennsylvania Avenue to the north, from where Washington measures itself to other parts of the city. Independence Avenue to the south, Constitution right in the center. And you'll see when we get up to the west side of the Capitol why it was that President Reagan loved this particular vista so much, and why he decided, as Sam and others have mentioned in the course of the day, to have his first inauguration on the west side of the Capitol, and why it will be so prominent again today. Barbara Walters is with us again, and as we watch the caisson being lifted on, Barbara, can I just get a brief comment from you on who will come to this funeral, because it's by invitation only?
It is by invitation only. This afternoon from 4:30 on, there were invitations sent to a great many people who could come early to go to the Capitol so that they could view the coffin before it is open to the public. And many of them, I think, were there when the alarm came that they should rush out. That's why, as Cokie mentioned, there were senators already there. Well, it's going to be quite an event tomorrow. There are 16 heads of state. Prince Charles is coming from Great Britain. He is an old and good friend of Mrs. Reagan's. In 1981, he came to New York. She took him to the ballet. They have remained friends for many years beyond his coming representing his country. He's coming as a personal friend. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was not expected to come because she's had a series of strokes, is coming, Peter, but she has pre-taped the remarks that she's going to make. Prime Minister Blair is in this country because he's part of the economic summit with President Bush. And then it's such a wide range. There are personal friends like Merv Griffin, whom you talked about yesterday when he was with Mrs. Reagan and her family at the library and was on the plane arriving. He is an old, old friend of President Reagan's from movie star days. Merv Griffin, who was a talk show host, so on, and has been a great supporter of Mrs. Reagan. Stop me, Peter, when you want to talk, and I'll come back later and tell you others.
Many thanks. the meticulous care with which any soldier's coffin would be covered by the flag, but in this case, the former commander-in-chief. While this is a multi-service operation, as we said, the Air Force and the Navy and the Coast Guard and the Marines, it is the 3rd U.S. Infantry, the Old Guard as it's called, based at Fort Myers in Virginia, which does more of this thing, this memorial procedure, than anybody else in the country. It is they at Arlington National Cemetery who are present at the Tomb of the Unknown. It is the Old Guard at Fort Myer, which attends veterans who are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And it was the Old Guard who went in part to California to attend the president at the Presidential Library and part of the way home. We'll have a chance to talk about the president and the Congress and the changes the president brought to Washington when the caisson gets rolling along. But the first order of business is to see that it is secure. Those are sirens, if you can hear them elsewhere in Washington, up here on Pennsylvania Avenue, above Pennsylvania Avenue, north of the White House, not related to the funeral procession at all. In 1981, when the first term of the president was getting underway, the people who organized the state funerals or organized funerals went to the President and Mrs. Reagan and asked them, unsettling experience perhaps, as we've said before, and asked what they would like for the president's funeral. More than 20 years ago. And during that period, this is what the president agreed to, and particularly Mrs. Reagan watched over.
Left wheel. Woo! Forward. Woo! We told everyone they had to stay. This is good. This is good. Go on. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And there is Sergeant York. The riderless horse, which is so central to this procession, named after or named for Sergeant Alvin York, celebrated American hero of World War I, and those are President Reagan's riding boots in the stirrups, reversed as is tradition, to reflect many things, but to reflect particularly the notion that the former commander-in-chief is looking back on his troops as they follow him in procession. Former racehorse from New Jersey, given to the Old Guard some years ago. He's 13, given to the old guard, largely on the basis of the fact that he's a lovely color and a uniform black, but also because he is calm and able to perform, which is what he is doing, in the face of any and every provocation. Did fairly well as a racehorse, but is got a more important job now. Constitution Avenue is lined, as you can see, with members of the armed services in their dress or summer whites. It is a very, very hot day here in the Capitol as this procession moves off. Claire Shipman is, ABC's Claire Shipman is out on Constitution Avenue. Claire, is a crowd gathering, and how are they coping with the heat?
Peter, it's an enormous crowd at this point, 7 or 8, in some places 10 deep, and some aren't coping with the heat that well. Right in front of us, as you said, there are a number of men and women from all of the armed services here. One of the airmen who was standing in front of us was literally just taken away. He threw up, was so overcome with dehydration. It's quite hot, and people have been standing for hours. A lot of the people who are visiting have been here for much of the day, trying to get a front row glimpse of this spectacle that in many cases that they've only read about or seen images of from either President Kennedy or President Johnson's services.
Jake Tapper is up at Maryland and 3rd, up closer to the Capitol, and from him we know at least that the Speaker of the House has been concerned about people waiting in line and has provided vast amounts of water for the day. Jake.
That's right, Peter. Speaker Hastert has ordered about 219,000 bottles of water, which are standing here alongside the reflecting pool. There are hundreds of mourners who have come here. One has been waiting here since 5 this morning. They've come from all over. We've heard their stories. We've heard of an 11.5-hour car ride from Augusta, Maine, a family from Iowa that canceled their family vacation, a 10-hour bus ride from Johnson City, Tennessee. All have come here to pay their final respects.
There are 3 bands participating in this procession, playing a series of tunes which again were carefully selected. The U.S. Marines are here, the U.S. Army Band, the U.S. Marines, of course, the President's own, the U.S. Army Band, Pershing's own, the U.S. Navy Band, and the U.S. Air Force. Gives us a chance, of course, to talk about former President Reagan as the caisson moves very slowly up Constitution Avenue. It will take them 45 minutes, perhaps, to get to the Capitol. It will take 25 or 30 minutes to get up the steps and into and established in the rotunda where the members of the Senate and the House and the diplomatic corps, and as Barbara Walters said, any number of foreign guests await the President. Sam Donaldson, you covered the President for so long. Your career was, in some respects, defined by your coverage of President Reagan for a long period of time. Want to talk a little bit about your memories of him now?
Well, Peter, I always knew that he was President of the United States, and I wasn't. I was just a reporter. But in trying to question him and cover him over the years, I think President Reagan, being the showman that he was and understanding how that worked, would often use reporters as sort of foils. I mean, we'd ask him a question, and he'd think of a one-liner, a snapping one-liner, you know, and come back, and everybody would laugh, and that would satisfy it. He was interesting to cover because he was an interesting person and because he participated and led interesting events, Peter. I mean, that's kind of a combination. I've covered people, so have you, who have been interesting, but they didn't do much, and vice versa. But with Ronald Reagan, you got a twofer. You know, someone said the other day, all of the funeral preparation and what we're seeing right now, the pageantry of this very impressive and solemn procession, that Ronald Reagan would be looking down and say, oh, gee, all this fuss for me? Well, maybe so, but remember, he brought to Washington a certain style that had been lacking. For instance, in the state visits, when the leaders would come, they introduced the fife and drum corps that dressed up in revolutionary garb, so that the state visitor would not just troop the line, he would actually see the kind of pageantry. I think President Reagan loved pageantry. Clearly, he did it so well himself when it came to the presentation, whether it was at Normandy or whether it was here in the South Lawn of the White House. But covering him was always interesting. People say, well, Sam, you used to yell at him. He'd be on the way to the helicopter, and that's right. I mean, I was one of those who yelled at him because we were kept 50 yards away, and he'd cup his hand. He said, what? But Peter, when he heard a question he wanted to answer, he came right over the rope line, and he answered it. So I thought, particularly in his first term, a lot of the cupping of the hand was just one of those elegant little excuses that he would use. You know, someone else might just march stiffly by and not say a word. It looked like, you know, he was really shunning us. But Reagan could do it with such style. I suppose one of the things, other than the question of his policies, which, of course, you talk about the sizzle versus the steak, one of the things that marked him was style.
And we'll talk about the president's policies as today, tomorrow, and Friday ensue. George Stephanopoulos made an interesting point earlier today that as time passes, that, as I said, time since Saturday, more and more people have talked about the president's policies. But at the moment, it seems more appropriate, Michael Beschloss, our historian, to talk about the person. He had, as Sam Donaldson describes, an apparent innate modesty.
He did, and the geniality that we've heard so much over the last couple of days. But you know, Peter, in watching this, what this reminds me of is probably the most famous trip that Ronald Reagan made up Capitol Hill, which was, of course, in January of 1981, 1981, when he was first inaugurated president. And he rode up in that car with Jimmy Carter, and it was a special day because the Iran hostages were about to be released, and Carter was distracted and on the telephone. And there was a rather chilly atmosphere between Reagan and Carter because, after all, they had run against each other in this fierce campaign that Reagan had won. And as I was told a couple of months ago by a Carter aide, Reagan kept on trying to warm up the atmosphere with Carter by telling him these wonderful old Hollywood stories of his that Reagan used to tell so often about the moguls, the leaders of the studios, and so forth. Apparently, it was totally lost on Carter. When they got out of the car, Carter later went over to one of his aides and said, "Who is this Jack Warner he keeps on talking about?" referring to the head of Warner Brothers.
Exactly. Oh, how we remember that day so well. It was such a sunny opening to Ronald Reagan's presidency, the release of the hostages. Those of us who were overseas at the time were absolutely convinced on the night before that the leadership in Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was going to let Jimmy Carter hang out to dry right up to and through the end of his presidency. And so Jimmy Carter, who, as Sam knows, worked in the White House, worked the phones throughout the entire night from the Oval Office, his last night in office. It was on President Reagan's watch that the hostages who'd been held for more than 400 days in Iran were actually released. George Stephanopoulos, this is something of a cynical town. It's at the very least a skeptical town, at least in terms of the political establishment. President Reagan seemed undeterred by that.
Oh, absolutely not. He always kept some distance from Washington, even though, as Michael Beschloss says, he wanted to be a resident of Washington. He knew that his strength in many ways came from representing the people outside of Washington. But Peter, I'm struck as I watch this right now, as much by memories of George Washington as Ronald Reagan, because this whole ceremony says something about the office of the president. It's a very, very unique office. The president is commander-in-chief. He's going back to the Capitol in a military case on, there was always this tension in the office of the president between how much was it going to feel like a monarchy, and there's the pageantry of a monarchy right now. He's being celebrated like a king, but when they govern as citizens, and all that comes together, all that is coming together in this ceremony today.
And as I said, every service is participating. The Army, the Naval Academy is here. The U.S. Air Force Academy is represented with a squadron here today. The Coast Guard and several bands. From West Point. West Point just had his graduation, and some of these cadets know full well, the seniors at least, that within a year they may well be in combat. Our guest today is actually with us from Paris. This capital city of Washington has such a historic connection to the French. In Paris tonight with us is the American journalist Richard Reeves, who has written books about a number of American political figures, not only Robert Kennedy and President Nixon, and is in the process of writing one now about Ronald Reagan. Dick, I must say, I want to ask you, first of all, with all of the biographies about President Reagan and all the writing about President Reagan, what has inspired you to do another one?
Well, I think the success of the Kennedy and Nixon books inspired my publisher to make it worthwhile, even though I had often been a critic. At this point, I've interviewed several hundred people about Ronald Reagan, many of whom worked for him. But the last question I've asked has always been the same, and that is, do you think Ronald Reagan was a great man? And every single person I've talked to, whether one of his people or others, have said yes. And they often point to the unique quality of the man, which shows up in the fact that we have a thing called Reaganism. We don't have Clintonism, Eisenhowerism, Nixonism. There was something unique about Ronald Reagan and the way he approached the presidency and the way he approached America. He was a great man. Great president's a different question, but he was a great man because he changed the way people think. He created the conservative movement and the Republican Party as we know it by bringing an awful lot of hostile people together, whether they were Wall Street people or Baptists from the South, libertarians, physical conservatives who had been squabbling forever, and they were brought together to be part of Reaganism. And he created the politics, the governing party we live with now. He changed his people would like to say he won the Cold War. I don't think any one man can win the Cold War, but he had a lot to do with it. And part of that was changing the language. When he became president, we talked about détente and containment. He didn't believe in those things. When the Republicans tried to brief him, their foreign policy experts, and said, you have to have a strategy. And after listening to them for several hours, he said, I know you guys don't think I know anything about this, but I do have a strategy, even if you don't like it. And that strategy is, we win, they lose. He changed the nature of American populism from the people who were oppressing the little guy, used to be big business, the Wall Street, the railroads, the banks. He made the oppressor, in a new populism, big government. He also, as Richard Cheney confirmed for us recently, proved, I don't know if he proved, attempted to show deficits don't matter, that the government can spend as much money as it wants, and he was one of the great big spenders, no matter what his speeches said. So
Let me
that we're
ask you a
dealing
question. Let me ask you a question in terms of the
with
man.
a unique political property.
Let me ask you a question about the man again, in terms of all the research you have done and all the people. Did anything actually surprise you about Ronald Reagan that you thought you didn't know about him as a person?
No, nothing surprised. Well, him as a person, what surprises you the most is that he had no friends, and that the people who worked for him were employees, and most of them never spoke to him again after the day they left his service. And some of them, grown men, would break into tears when you asked them that question. That did surprise me. His warmth only went to the people who were with him at a given moment. He seemed to forget them as soon as they left. I think the things that I didn't know was old men are different than young men. I had spent years working on John Kennedy and on Richard Nixon, and these were men who cared desperately what other people thought about them, what history thought about them. As far as I can tell, Ronald Reagan didn't give a damn. Like Eisenhower, he was an old man, his ambition was past him. And then the other thing I found out, it'd be interesting to, I don't know what Lucannon and Michael Beschloss think about it, but the single thing that impresses me most about Ronald Reagan is a profound understanding of the fact that words are more important than deeds. It's words that change countries. It's words that change the world. And he spent all his time with words, writing speeches, editing speeches, giving speeches, writing letters, because he knew in the end that was more important than deeds. And I don't think many men of great power had figured that out.
Many thanks, Richard. A very interesting portrait of Ronald Reagan. Old men are different than young men. And as America has experienced in the last 50 years, there has been nobody quite as able, as skilled with words as Ronald Reagan. He did not get the appellation, or the nickname, if you will, the great communicator, for nothing. Part of the Navy contingent here today. Every service, as we said, represented in the parade for the former Commander-in-Chief. Lucannon, as I said earlier, is the dean of Ronald Reagan watchers and biographers. Has been covering Ronald Reagan since 1964. As soon as we listen to this band for a minute, we'll get his early take on the man he knew so well as a reporter. President and Mrs. Reagan in 1981. members again of the Multi-Service Honor Guard, which will keep a vigil for the president on Capitol Hill and at his coffin under the great rotunda there. The absolute centerpiece of the national capital. Nothing in this nation's capital more closely representing the people of the United States than the Capitol dome and the two houses on either side, the House and the Senate. Mrs. Reagan said a couple of times in the last couple of days she wanted people to be represented in these farewells to the president, and you can see them many deep now on both sides of Constitution Avenue. From 180 feet up, there is the catafalque on which Lincoln's coffin rested, on which Ronald Reagan's will rest. Lou Cannon, as I said, the most prolific biographer of Ronald Reagan, is still in California, to which the president will return on Friday, listening to his journalistic colleague Dick Reeves in Paris. Lou, pick up a little, if you would, on this notion that President Reagan had associates but not friends.
I think Ronald Reagan's great friend was the United States of America. He sort of devoted his warmth to the country. He did it all those years in so many guises, as a Democrat, as a Republican. This great speech he gives in 1952 when he was a Democrat, but he could have given it 20 years later. He calls America the beautiful. And I think Ronald Reagan was really a man of the public. It was almost like he didn't quite have as much time for individual people because he had time for all of us. I remember this day so well, Peter, the 1981 day. And there was something about, I'm sure Sam remembers this, we'd been having a cold Washington winter, and on this one day, it thaws. And we get one of those January thaws that are welcome in the middle of a Washington winter, and it was a warm day. And people were taking their coats off on the lawn under the watching Ronald Reagan. And people were actually talking about that. They didn't need journalists to do the symbolism for us. It suddenly warmed up in Washington. And then Reagan gives this speech. He's looking down. He gives this speech from the West Front. He's, as Sam recounted, looking down the mall and across to the cemeteries in Arlington. And he's talking about heroes. And he says, we have every right to dream heroic dreams. And I think the sort of anomaly to pick up on what Richard Reeves was saying about old men being different, Ronald Reagan was the first Republican president, the first Republican presidential candidate to get more votes among the youngest group of American voters than the Democratic candidate. I think that's because he looked to the future, as well as to the past, and that young people do like to dream heroic dreams, and they had this old president of theirs dreaming along with them.
The president's daughter, Patty Davis, writes in an essay in Newsweek this week that my father belonged to the country. I resented the country at times for its demands on him, she said, its ownership of him, but to absolutely from a Panley point of view, to reaffirm what Lou just said, Patty Davis says, America was the important child in the family, the one who got the most attention. George Stephanopoulos, when Bill Clinton, for whom you worked, came along, there were all sorts of things about Ronald Reagan that Bill Clinton admired and wanted to take on the campaign trail with him.
And wanted to be a great communicator. What they shared and what Clinton tried to bring to the campaign trail was that optimism that Ronald Reagan demonstrated in every public statement. When you talk, Lou Cannon talks about dreaming heroic dreams. He communicated that every single day. But even in little points of style, Ronald Reagan was a great dresser for a president, always looked in command, always had every hair in place, every article of clothing fit perfectly. It turns out to be important for a president. On every major speech, Ronald Reagan was often the template we looked back to. I think of in Normandy, Ronald Reagan spoke at the 40th anniversary of the invasion. Bill Clinton had to speak at the 50th anniversary, and he studied that speech for days and weeks, finally coming up with how the next generation could carry on the tradition, talking about we are the children of your sacrifice. One final point on that, Peter, even Nancy Reagan was a pace setter in terms of presidential style and presidential communication. Barbara Walters was early on talking about how she had a stormy start in Washington. There was that great controversy over her buying new china for the White House. It was quite expensive, probably the most expensive china bought at that time. And the way that Nancy Reagan went out and handled it, she went to the gridiron dinner, sang Secondhand Rose, slayed the place, and the controversy went away. Every president that's followed has tried to copy those moments and carry on that tradition.
Mrs. Reagan, of course, has traveled a long road in this respect, having gone from designer clothes and very active social life to Alzheimer's and stem cell research. And many of her friends and admirers on these two subjects believe that once the president has been laid to rest, Mrs. Reagan will become a very active public presence on behalf of Alzheimer's disease and stem cell research, which has been a real issue for the Bush administration, with which Mrs. Reagan certainly disagrees. Sergeant York, so named the riderless horse for an American soldier who fought in the First World War, who was in fact a conscientious objector and had his conscientious objector status denied, went to war, became a hero protecting his comrades, won the Congressional Medal of Honor. His name given to this riderless horse, which is so much a feature and a symbol of this processional parade for a former commander-in-chief. Claire Shipman on Constitution Avenue. Claire?
Peter, it's interesting. We just watched Mrs. Reagan's car pass, and she's been waving to the crowds who are thrilled to get a glimpse of her. And the crowds have been remarkably hushed, almost awed in their respect as they watch this procession go by. It's so many people are here from so many different places. We met one young couple who was so inspired by the Reagans as teenagers, they named their 2-year-old toddler Reagan, and they're all here watching this. For the most part, it's an enormous amount of respect for President Reagan. Oh, Peter, they're the fighters.
Salute to the president. And a single aircraft peels off to establish its final honor, the single man formation. It all happened very quickly. They'd flown up here from North Carolina. They had circled just southeast of the city until the precise moment on the schedule, and then 21 of them come and gone in salute very quickly. Michael Beschloss reminded often in these days that there's a whole generation behind those of us who lived through the Reagan's presidency who have to think he's been away from the presidency 20 years, out of the public eye with Alzheimer's for 10. Take us back a little to the mid-1960s when 1964 Barry Goldwater, the conservative Republican, is running for office and is defeated, but Ronald Reagan springs to national political attention.
That's right. That was really the locust years for American conservatism. 1964, Lyndon Johnson was elected by this huge landslide, and conservatism looked sort of like a dry creek, that there were going to be very few candidates elected on that platform. And so in California, a number of people come to Ronald Reagan, largely because of that speech he made during the week before the 1964 election on television for Barry Goldwater, someone who gave the sense of conservatism with a human face, a face that many people thought that Goldwater did not have. Wins this huge election in 1966, governor of California, to many people's surprise. And Reagan always felt that conservatism need not necessarily be a minority. And so sticking to many of the same positions during the years between then and 1980, Reagan managed not only to make it himself to the White House, but to transform the Republican Party. You know, sometimes, Peter, we forget that in 1980, George Bush, the elder, who at that point was from the Northeast, was considered a moderate, almost won the Republican nomination. The party was almost divided between conservatism and moderation. Nowadays, in 2004, the Republican Party is a Ronald Reagan party, 90 to 100% conservative, religious, and from the Southwest.
Thank you, Michael. Senators and congressmen in the rotunda, all senators there, waiting in the rotunda. This giant, dramatic space, 180 feet high, 90-some-odd feet across, which looks rather small, even with its 8 great paintings about American history and American life, when so many people get into it. Barbara Walters, talk a little bit about the Reagan years in the White House as we watch the president come up Constitution Avenue, because one thing it seems very different from is this Republican White House.
Well, I want to pick up a little bit about what Richard Reeves and Luke Cannon were talking about, and that is the president's lack of friends. Because, of course, his closest friend and most influential advisor probably was Mrs. Reagan. Peter, I don't think there has been anyone as influential with her husband as Mrs. Reagan, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton. And when George Stephanopoulos was talking about how she went from buying china and clothes and everything was hunky-dory, the truth is it really wasn't. By the way, the china that she was criticized for, she was very defensive about. She said it was paid for by friends. But as the years went on, in the beginning, this was a very unpopular First Lady, and Mrs. Reagan was deeply disturbed by that. There were things that she had done that were very controversial, even her breast cancer. When she had a mastectomy, Peter, instead of a lumpectomy, people said at that point, why is she doing that? It's a bad example. And then there was the whole business of her influence on the president. And I asked her about that at one point, how much influence she had. And she said, mainly in the realm of people. He never thinks that anybody is taking advantage of him or end-running him, but I can usually spot pretty well, and all the little antennae go up. She was the one who would say, this one isn't doing too well, this one doesn't like it. Remember, too, Peter, she was responsible for the firing of his chief of staff at the end of his White House, Don Reagan. And then Don Reagan wrote a book in which he said that almost every single decision made in the White House was made by an astrologer. Remember all that hoopla? Mrs. Reagan's astrologer, a woman named Joan Quigley. So she had this very controversial and tumultuous years. And then when she went back to California, almost the way some ex-presidents
Barbara, before you go back,
Yes.
to California, as we're watching the President and Mrs. Reagan dance on their inauguration in 1981, talk a little bit about the glamour of the White House. A lot of kids don't know about it today.
Well, there's both good and bad glamour, Peter, I'm glad you brought it up because I think people forget, that the young people don't know, that when Reagan first came in as president, it was very glamorous. Movie stars. He was a movie star. At the White House, there were always movie stars. At the first inauguration, all his friends' wives came in their mink coats. Mrs. Reagan always dressed so magnificently and expensively. And this was the first time we saw her with her hair up. And they danced every single dance at every one of the balls for a very long time, cheek to cheek. So those years in the White House were, to a large degree, the Hollywood years and the most glamorous years, again, until Bill Clinton came in with his love of movie stars. The difference was that with the Reagans, they were people who had known President Reagan from his own movie stars' days.
Many thanks, Barbara. I was also thinking, and I defer to Lou Cannon on this now, and also to Sam Donaldson, what a stark contrast this was, this town, to the Carter administration. Lou?
I was thinking exactly the same thing, Peter, that when alluding to what Michael Beschloss said earlier, Ronald Reagan came to town, and it was like Prohibition was over. In fact, they started serving alcohol again in the White House. They saw people. Nancy Reagan became close friends with the publisher of the newspaper I worked for, the Washington Post, and with the editorial page editor, Meg Greenfield. They had friends over. They had parties. So Washington went all at once from being kind of an austere, button-down town to one that was sort of wide open with glamour and parties and Hollywood and all this stuff thrown in. And it really was a change of mood. It affronted some people. It made others quite happy.
As we look at the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives waiting in the rotunda for the president to arrive, I asked roughly the same question of Cokie Roberts. How did this town change from President Carter to Ronald Reagan?
What's so interesting about what Lou just said is, of course, it was the conservative president who brought in the parties and the liquor and the Hollywood people, which is somewhat ironic after President Carter was certainly very austere, and members of Congress used to complain that when they went to the White House that he would lecture them instead of engage them. Now, members of Congress complained that when they went to the White House with President Reagan that he didn't pay attention to them, but he amused them. And they did like that. But you know, it was so interesting, Peter, because he kept running against Washington, even after he made his overtures. He ran for his second term as an outsider, which is quite something to do. But he left a permanent mark on this city in all kinds of ways, not just in terms of style, but in terms of substance. There are all kinds of conservative think tanks that exist here as a result of the Reagan years, and people who came into Washington and were interested in government because of Ronald Reagan on the right. That had been true on the left for a very long time. Ronald Reagan made it happen on the right. And there are people we quote all the time in our stories that we have come to rely on as a balancing force, who really are here because Ronald Reagan was here.
And just before I lose him, and as the caisson gets very close to the west side of the Capitol, once more to Richard Reeves in Paris, use you as a reporter this time, if I may, Richard, as to how the Europeans have thought and talked about the president since he died last Saturday, and how popular or unpopular is the United States there today, do you think?
Well, I lived here in Paris for 4 years, the first 4 years of the Reagan administration. Oddly enough, we were both living in Pacific Palisades, California in 1980, and then when he left in January of 81, we left the same day, although he seemed to have a bigger impact than I did. I go back, so much of the early success of Ronald Reagan had to do with the late failure of Jimmy Carter. And although his ideology was different than most Europeans, what the Europeans wanted from an American president was strength and predictability. And they didn't get that from Jimmy Carter. So that Reagan was old. I remember very well the day of walking the streets of Paris on the day the Challenger exploded. And people, French people, coming up and hugging me and saying how bad they felt about that and how much they loved this cowboy, our president. And I think that it always, his popularity here was always underrated. There was never the kind of feeling about the United States here in those days that there is now. Because among other things, when Ronald Reagan in the beginning dealt totally with America, was a domestic economy. Yes, the Europeans didn't like him then because he ignored them. But when he did turn to foreign policy and turn to them, most of them were as charmed as Americans were by this guy.
Thank you very much, Dick Reeves. I said, widely known American journalist and historian, currently writing a book on Ronald Reagan and the caisson drawn by 6 blacks, arrives at the west side of the Capitol. The west side of the Capitol, where the President's first inauguration was held, and Sam Donaldson, I think it was, mentioned earlier that a lot invested in why he's arrived at the west side of the Capitol again today. Part of the reason is clearly that the construction being done on the east side of the Capitol, so that west side is far the more natural place to have. But in many ways, the west far more dramatic, with the vistas across down the mall to the Lincoln Memorial. Now the President's coffin will be taken from the caisson, carried up the steps into the rotunda and laid on this simple black platform made of pine boards, used first for President Lincoln lying in state in 1865, used many times since, kept in the Capitol. It certainly reminds me to go to our Capitol Hill correspondent, Linda Douglas, now, who is deeply invested in the history of the place. Linda?
What I'm thinking here, Peter, is really about how much symmetry and how much closure there is with this whole experience, where you have President Reagan, who was the first president to be inaugurated on the west side, the west front of the Capitol, and many said he loved looking west. He was sworn in the second time in the rotunda, where he will lie in state. And of course, he was known here, as they look back on him now, both Democrats and Republicans, as a man who really pulled people together, who really connected the White House with the Congress. He came up to the Hill many times to meet with the members of Congress. He had drinks with the very democratic, liberal, fiery Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. They were friends after hours, he always said. You've heard much reminiscing nostalgically by Democrats this week about how he worked so well with them. Of course, the rotunda is the place in the Capitol that is supposed to pull the House and the Senate together. It's the central place where they meet, and that's what he symbolizes to many of them today.
This great rotunda, which so dominates the skyline here in the city, designed back in 1793, always been the centerpiece of the design and of the subsequent construction. And you can see some of the huge paintings in there, all of which have to do dramatically and with dramatic elements in American history. The Pilgrims leaving Holland, Columbus discovering America, the founders signing the Declaration. And it can be, Linda, can it not, an uncanny place in that you can feel rather strange when you're in there all by yourself or with very few people, quite unlike what it is today.
It has a sort of ghostly feel, as you're absolutely right, Peter. Whenever one of us gets the pleasure of walking through the often empty Capitol. The Capitol is often empty these days because there is so much security here. The tours have really been cut back, and you have this ghostly sense of walking through history, to walk through the rotunda, which has so much history, and to stand in the area where the president's body will lie in state, below which is, as you're going to, I'm sure, talk about later, the area that was supposed to be the crypt for George Washington. You really do feel that you're surrounded by ghosts.
Well, so many people have lain in state. We've talked about it so many times. I was looking at a photograph earlier today of President Reagan standing in the rotunda when the remains of the unknown soldier from Vietnam lay in state before they were interred at Arlington. And so, ironically, the president knew fully what to expect at a state funeral. Some Americans watching today will remember this. President Kennedy lying in state in 1963. Douglas MacArthur, the great World War II general, lay in state here. Herbert Hoover, President Hoover, President Eisenhower, President Johnson, of course, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the unknown soldier of the Vietnam era, of course. The first to lie in state was Henry Clay in 1852. They had a memorial service for him, member of the House of Representatives, in the Senate chamber. He'd been Speaker, Secretary of State, Senator from Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln, of course, and much is made of this catafalque there in the center of the rotunda, on which banged together pretty quickly when President Lincoln, was assassinated in 1865, but now invested, as so much of this place is, with so much history. There's no other building, not even the White House, which is so intimately linked with the lives of all the people of the United States. William McKinley lay in state here. And so too did Pierre L'Enfant, who was the planner of the city of Washington, one of the world's most unquestionably beautiful capitals. Lay in state in 1825 and was buried in Prince George's County. And you hear the president referred to by all of our commentators and colleagues today as believing deeply in the people of the United States. It is high above the Congress, way above where this camera looks down today, at the base of the Statue of Freedom, that the words, most significant words, are written, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And there are some of the many. Everybody but Mrs. Reagan has now arrived. That's Ron and his wife, the various other members of the family, Patty Davis, other members of the entourage. That's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Speaker Hastert down there in the left-hand corner. Yes, let's change seats. I can. Michael Beschloss, what is sometimes, and I've referred to it a couple of times, as the long goodbye continues. We've had state funerals before, and we've gone on longer.
That's true, and the best example of that, of course, would be what you were just mentioning, Peter, which was Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the middle of April. He wasn't buried in Springfield, Illinois until almost the end of May, and that was because not only were there services in Washington, but a long train trip that went from Washington to New York City to upstate New York, across Ohio to Chicago, and down to Springfield. And in every major city along the way, Lincoln's coffin would be taken off the train. They'd have a local memorial service with the open casket. People could express themselves.
The Washington Post, the leading newspaper here in the capital, referred to the rotunda in an article this morning as theater in the round, and pointed out that Americans love ceremony. Michael.
Same position that occupies in London. And I think one reason for that is that we have so few events that really do bind us together. We have inaugurations. One of the few other ones is, sadly, state funerals. We're in a very politicized country, a very divided country. Presidents have to do a lot of things that alienate people. There are few ceremonies, oddly enough, like this, that do bring us all together.
Many of the people who were together down on Constitution Avenue have now come up to stand on the edge of the reflecting pool down at the foot of the steps. ABC's Jake Tapper is there.
Well, Peter, it's quite a remarkable sight. There were just a few hundred people here waiting, and then the procession proceeded from Constitution Avenue into the Capitol area, and literally thousands upon thousands of Americans, mourners who had been lining the streets of Constitution Avenue, started walking slowly to join the line to come and visit and pay their last respects to President Reagan. It was also quite a remarkable sight just a few minutes ago when 21 F-15s performed their flyover, and one jet in the last group peeled off to form what's called the missing man formation. Many people in the crowd applauded, some saluted, and quite a few were moved to tears.
Barbara Walters, maybe this is to say the absolute obvious, but Mrs. Reagan looks more alone than I had ever imagined she might look.
Absolutely. And you know, earlier today, Peter, you described her as strong in personality, but frail. And as you can see, she really is holding on and can barely walk. I didn't want to leave my comments about her with the controversy. If we have a moment, I'd like to talk about when she changed. And that really is, I think, when they went back to California. She had a drug program, Just Say No, while she was in the White House. It wasn't that successful. When she went back to California and had these years of dignity and behaved with such elegance, and also she became very involved with Charles Wick's son. Charles Wick was the head of the USIA and a very good friend of the family. His son has a daughter who has juvenile diabetes. His name is Doug Wick. And he talked to Mrs. Reagan about his daughter and the difference stem cells would make. I'm going to stop now, Peter, for this. I'll come back.
to the strains of what was at one point the best-known Civil War song for the Union side, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. First a poem, the multi-service honor guard and the multi-service pallbearers take President Reagan up the 99 steps of the west side of the Capitol to where he was sworn in the first time as the 40th president. To say about Ronald Reagan today, and so much to talk about. Godspeed, indeed. We've talked about his optimism and his modesty, his equanimity and his persistence. Not talked a lot yet about his relationship to African Americans. Not heard much on this particular day. Seems appropriate from his critics. Still outside. You covered him for so long, Sam?
We're here. What? Hold on.
As you look at Mrs. Reagan today having to go through all this, remember she's 82. All over the country and at American installations around the world, and every hour throughout the day at every military installation in the world where American servicemen and women are stationed. One gun on the hour. And here, as you heard, a 21-gun salute for the third time today. You can see that for the last several days at the President's childhood home in Dixon, Illinois, people have been showing up there as well and leaving flowers and memorabilia in his honor. It's true at the Reagan Library in California. It was true at the funeral home in Santa Monica, and it is true throughout Washington today. There is the cream of the current political establishment. On the left, I'm sure you recognize him by now, Ronald Reagan, and Simi Valley, the presidential library to which the president will return tomorrow to be buried. The rotunda is going to be open later this evening to members of the public, which is a difficult challenge, again, for the security services. Senator Bill Frist on the left, Nancy Pelosi, Tom DeLay from the Congress, members of the House of Representatives in this particular group here. Every step precise, every step planned in due course, as the planners of this would say. Linda Douglas pointed out the president's second inaugural was here in the rotunda because it was so cold outside. But the president did appear to have a particular fondness for the vistas which were evident to all from the west side of the Capitol. And he's come today up Constitution Avenue past many of the monuments and the shrines, as the president said in his first inaugural, to those giants on whose shoulders we, the rest of us, stand. Members of the Supreme Court, not in their familiar, Justice Thomas on the right, Justice Breyer beside him, Justice Kennedy, Justice Scalia in the foreground there. Senator Daschle, the Democratic leader in the center there in the striped tie. Next to Senator Frist, the Republican leader. Two men not having a personal relationship at the moment, which Ronald Reagan would approve of. Senator Frist out campaigning for Senator Daschle's opponent in the Dakotas, the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. The House and the Senate have done nothing for the last couple of days except talk about President Reagan. There isn't a great deal to be done at the moment. Linda Douglas, our congressional correspondent, points out that there's a lot of legislation got out of the House of Representatives being held up in the Senate. The Senator pro tem is there tonight, Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska. And the other speakers there today will be Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House, and Vice President Cheney, of whom we have yet to catch a glimpse. Members of the diplomatic corps, 142 countries, I think, have accepted invitations to the state funeral. Members of the House of Representatives again. Maxine Waters, Congresswoman from California. And wreaths will be laid here. The Air Force singing sergeants will sing America the Beautiful. Senate chaplain Barry Black will give a blessing. Chaplain of the House Daniel Coughlin will have remarks. The U.S. Army Brass will play God Bless America, and official Washington will depart, and the people will have an opportunity to say goodbye. It may be that this is the very beginning of the line now. It looks a little bit like it down by the edge of the reflecting pool. Public viewing is going to last about 34 hours, beginning tonight about 9 p.m. local time, and continue until 7 a.m. on Friday, when the President's body will be taken to the National Cathedral for the national commemoration of his life, and then back to California, not tomorrow, as I said, but late on Friday in time for sunset on the Pacific coast. Members of Congress, when Mr. Reagan was the president, certainly know that the clarity of his agenda was always evident. Members of the Honor Guard or Vigil Guard, who will stand at the 4 points of the catafalque for all these hours and be replaced every 30 minutes by others. A large contingent of men and, we assume, women. Linda Douglas, as I look at this crowd of Democrats and Republicans who spend much of the time at each other's throats these days, united on this particular day by the president.
Well, it's been fascinating to listen to the debate, if you can call it that, for the last several days, where Democrats are saying that they yearn for the happier days of Ronald Reagan, the time, as I mentioned to you earlier, where the two parties at least were speaking to each other. What's ironic about that, of course, is that it was Ronald Reagan who laid the groundwork for the ultimate Republican takeover of the Congress. He certainly had a friendlier approach to the Democrats, a less partisan attitude the parties had toward each other than exists today. But the fact is, he gave a lot of encouragement to the people who ultimately took over the Congress, Newt Gingrich and so forth. The Republicans who've been talking on the floor have been talking about how vindicated they feel, how long they toiled in the wilderness of a much maligned minority, certainly back in the 70s and 80s, until Ronald Reagan gave them the heft and the pride that they needed. This is a very rare moment, Peter, of the two parties coming together for a common emotion. They are all grieving, and they all stand in admiration in one way or another for Ronald Reagan. They will no doubt go back to their corners when this is over, but they are together tonight.
Many thanks. Linda Douglas. ABC's Cokie Roberts has spent a good deal of her professional life in the confines of this building. Cokie?
My professional and personal life, it is something to see this rotunda, because it is, as you've said, the place that people come together. And these line and state ceremonies do have a healing effect. It'll be curious to see. I'll be curious to see if the Congress can behave for a little while after this. I remember when Lyndon Johnson was line in state, Mrs. Johnson stayed through much of the night. And of course, it was only a few years after his presidency. It ended with so much hostility and animus. And one of the Vietnam War protesters came to her in the middle of the night and said, "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry we were so awful to him." And she said, "That's okay. He's long ago forgiven you." So I do think that there are these moments of coming together that can make a difference in the body politic. And of course, they're all standing there. You've seen them as they've come into the rotunda looking up. And they're all looking up at the apotheosis of George Washington, that great Constantine Brumidi painting. It's George Washington in heaven. And of course, that is the great hope for all of the politicians standing under there, that what they are doing here will get them to heaven, and maybe a sense that a little more comity would go a long way toward that end.
Quick glimpse you had there of Vice President Cheney and Mrs. Cheney there with Mrs. Reagan, the Vice President's wife. Long members of the political establishment in Washington. Vice President Cheney came to the House of Representatives in the late 1970s, 78.
Let us pray. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote, "Neither does the actor suffer, nor the patient act, but both are fixed in an eternal patience, an eternal act. And the wheel turns. The wheel turns and is forever still." Ronald Wilson Reagan had many roles to play in life: husband, father, governor. But the most notable role on the world stage was that of the 40th President of the United States of America. With his style and grace, he made it seem easy. With his compassion and sense of timing, he brought strength of character to the nation and enkindled hope in a darkened world. As the patient, he brought humility to greatness and presided over embracing life to its natural end and dying with dignity, surrounded by love. To you, O Lord, ever patient with all of us, ever active in all of us, be praise and thanks for the life and impact Ronald Reagan has had upon us all. Support with your grace the Reagan family, and especially Mrs. Nancy Reagan, who stood by him in memorable moments of history and never left him in the long moments of difficult performance when the wheel turned all so slowly. Inspired by President Reagan, empower all of us, Lord, to employ our part in crumbling the walls of separation and in opening the gates to a globalized world. May our stillness here help us to remain faithful and patient with those suffering, and to make decisions that will renew faith in the future. All-powerful God, fix America in your eternal patience, in your eternal act, as the wheel turns, now and forever. Amen.
The House Chaplain, Daniel Coughlin. I believe the next person we will hear from is the chaplain of the Senate. But as you look at the Congress, the Capitol from a distance, any number of people have observed today, it was the perfect place for Ronald Reagan at this particular moment.
Mrs. Reagan, Patty, Ron, Michael, distinguished guests, members of the Reagan family, and friends of Ronald Reagan in America and throughout the world.
Senator
Tonight, President Ronald Reagan has returned to the People's House to be honored by millions of Americans who loved him. Since 1824, under this rotunda, our nation has paid final tribute to many dedicated public servants. President Abraham Lincoln was the first president to lie in state under this Capitol dome. In the coming days, thousands will come to these hallowed halls to say goodbye to another son of Illinois who, like Lincoln, appealed to our best hopes, not our worst fears. In the life of any nation, few men forever alter the course of history. Ronald Reagan was one of those men. He rose from a young boy who didn't have much to a man who had it all, including the love of a faithful partner and friend he found in his wife, Nancy. The true measure of any man is what he does with the opportunities life offers. By that standard, Ronald Reagan was one of America's greatest. He first proved that as governor of California and later as president of the United States. When Ronald Reagan was sworn in as our 40th president, this nation was gripped by a powerful malaise. Inflation and unemployment were soaring, and the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War. By the time President Reagan left office, he had reversed the trend of ever-increasing government control over our lives, restored our defense capabilities, guided us through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and set in motion policies which ultimately led to the collapse of the evil empire. His integrity, vision, and commitment were respected by all. But history's final judgment, I believe, will remember most his ability to inspire us. President Reagan put it best when he said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." This president inspired Americans by reaching out far beyond what he could attain. Like a good coach, he understood the value of a goal isn't always in achieving it. Sometimes it's enough to simply look out into the future and remind people what is possible. And often, President Reagan achieved the impossible. He reminded us that government is not the solution. The solution lies in each of us. True American heroes are ordinary people who live their lives with extraordinary character and strength. President Reagan showed us freedom was not just a slogan. He actually brought freedom to hundreds of thousands of people around this globe by opposing oppressive regimes. Those of us from the World War II generation looked up to him for his moral courage. In him, we saw leadership of great men like Eisenhower, who led the way and moved us to follow. On a wintry day in 1981, Ronald Reagan stood on the steps that lie just behind these doors to deliver his first inaugural address. He spoke of a journal written by a young American who went to France in 1917 and died for the cause of freedom. From that journal, he read these words: "I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully, and I will do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended upon me alone." Throughout his life, Ronald Reagan bore our burdens as if the income did depend on him alone. We will all remember him as an unparalleled leader and an exceptional man who lifted our nation and set the world on a new path. President Reagan achieved greatness in his life. Some might even argue he transcended it. He could not have accomplished this without Nancy. Nancy is one of the finest first ladies these United States have ever known. And the love Ronald and Nancy Reagan shared touched the hearts of people everywhere. In 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. In that speech, the president spoke of the shining city on a hill that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, still stands strong and true on the granite ridge. Now it is our turn to thank Ronald Reagan for making us believe in that shining city. And as we say farewell, his last words as president echo across this nation. If we listen, we will hear him whisper, the humble words he used to sum up his revolution. All in all, not bad at all.
Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert.
Mrs. Reagan, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and distinguished guests, Ronald Reagan's long journey has finally drawn to a close. It is altogether fitting and proper that he has returned to this Capitol Rotunda like another great son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, so the nation can say goodbye. This Capitol building is, for many, the greatest symbol of democracy and freedom in the world. It brings to mind the shining city on a hill, which President Reagan so often spoke. It is the right place to honor a man who so faithfully defended our freedom and so successfully helped extend the blessings of liberty to millions of people around the world. Mrs. Reagan, thank you for sharing your husband with us, for your steadfast love and for your great faith. We pray for you and for your family in this time of great mourning. But as we mourn, we must also celebrate the life and the vision of one of America's greatest presidents. His story and values are quintessentially American. Born in Tampico, Illinois, and then raised in Dixon, Illinois, he moved west to follow his dreams. He brought with him a Midwest optimism, and he blended it with a Western can-do spirit. In 1980, the year of the Reagan Revolution, his vision of hope, of growth, of opportunity was exactly what the American people needed and wanted. His message touched a fundamental core that is deeply embedded in the American experience. President Reagan dared to dream that America had a special mission. He believed in the essential goodness of the American people and that we had a special duty to promote peace and freedom for the rest of the world. Against the advice of the timid, he sent a chilling message to authoritarian governments everywhere that the civilized world would not rest until freedom reigned in every corner of the globe. While others worried, President Reagan persevered. When others weakened, President Reagan stood tall. When others stepped back, President Reagan stepped forward. And he did it all with great humility, with great charm, and with great humor. Tonight, we will open these doors and let the men and women who Ronald Reagan served so faithfully file past and say goodbye to a man who meant so much to so many. It is their being here that I think would mean more to him than any words that we may say. Because it was from America's great and good people that Ronald Reagan drew his strength. In the years ahead, we will tell our grandchildren about this night when we gathered here to honor the man from Illinois who became the son of California and then the son of all America. And then our grandchildren will tell their grandchildren, and President Reagan's spirit and eternal faith in America will carry on. Ronald Reagan helped make our country and this world a better place to live. But he always believed that our best days were ahead of us, not behind us. I can still hear him say, with that twinkle in his eye, "You ain't seen nothing yet." President Reagan once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." 20 years ago, President Reagan stood on the beaches of Normandy to honor those who made a life by what they gave. Recalling the men who scaled the cliffs and crossed the beaches in a merciless hail of bullets, he asked, who were these men? These ordinary men doing extraordinary things. His answer was simple and direct. They were Americans. So I can think of no higher tribute or honor or title to confer upon Ronald Reagan than just to simply say he was an American. Godspeed, Mr. President. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
The Vice President, Mr. Cheney.
Mrs. Reagan, members of the President's family, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow citizens. Knowing that this moment would come has not made it any easier to see the honor guard and the flag draped before us and to begin America's farewell to President Ronald Reagan. He said goodbye to us in a letter that showed his great courage and love for America. Yet for his friends and for his country, the parting comes only now. And in this national vigil of mourning, we show how much America loved this good man and how greatly we will miss him. A harsh winter morning in 1985 brought the inaugural ceremony inside to this rotunda. And standing in this place for the 50th presidential inauguration, Ronald Reagan spoke of a nation that was hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was how he saw America, and that is how America came to know him. There was a kindness, simplicity, and goodness of character that marked all the years of his life. When you mourn a man of 93, no one is left who remembers him as a child in his mother's arms. Ronald Wilson Reagan's life began in a time and place so different from our own, in a quiet town on the prairie on the 6th of February, 1911. Nell and Jack Reagan would live long enough to see the kind of man they had raised, but they could never know all that destiny had in store for the boy they called Dutch. And if they could witness this scene in 2004, their son taken to his rest with the full honors of the United States, they would be so proud of all he had done with the life they gave him and the things they taught him. President Reagan once said, "I learned from my father the value of hard work and ambition and maybe a little something about telling a story." That was the Ronald Reagan who confidently set out on his own from Dixon, Illinois during the Great Depression. The man who would one day speak before cameras and crowds with such ease and self-command. From my mother, said President Reagan, I learned the value of prayer. My mother told me that everything in life happened for a purpose. She said all things were part of God's plan, even the most disheartening setbacks, and in the end, everything worked out for the best. This was the Ronald Reagan who had faith not just in his own gifts and his own future, but in the possibilities of every life. The cheerful spirit that carried him forward was more than a disposition. It was the optimism of a faithful soul who trusted in God's purposes and knew those purposes to be right and true. He once said, "There's no question I am an idealist," which is another way of saying, I am an American. We usually associate that quality with youth, and yet one of the most idealistic men ever to become president was also the oldest. He excelled in professions that have left many others jaded and self-satisfied, and yet somehow remained untouched by the worst influences of fame or power. If Ronald Reagan ever uttered a cynical or cruel or selfish word, the moment went unrecorded. Those who knew him in his youth and those who knew him a lifetime later all remember his largeness of spirit, his gentle instincts, and a quiet rectitude that drew others to him. Seen now at a distance, his strengths as a man and as a leader are only more impressive. It's the nature of the city of Washington that men and women arrive, leave their mark, and go their way. Some figures who seemed quite large and important in their day are sometimes forgotten or remembered with ambivalence. Yet nearly a generation after the often impassioned debates of the Reagan years, what lingers from that time is almost all good. And this is because of the calm and kind man who stood at the center of events. We think back with appreciation for the decency of our 40th president and respect for all that he achieved. After so much turmoil in the 60s and 70s, our nation had begun to lose confidence, and some were heard to say that the presidency might even be too big for one man. That phrase did not survive the 1980s. For decades, America had waged a Cold War, and few believed it could possibly end in our own lifetimes. The president was one of those few, and it was the vision and the will of Ronald Reagan that gave hope to the oppressed, shamed the oppressors, and ended an evil empire. More than any other influence, the Cold War was ended by the perseverance and courage of one man who answered falsehood with truth and overcame evil with good. Ronald Reagan was more than an historic figure. He was a providential man who came along just when our nation and the world most needed him. And believing as he did that there is a plan at work in each life, he accepted not only the great duties that came to him, but also the great trials that came near the end. When he learned of his illness, his first thoughts were of Nancy. And who else but Ronald Reagan could face his own decline and death with a final message of hope to his country, telling us that for America, there is always a bright dawn ahead. Fellow Americans, here lies a graceful and a gallant man. Nancy, none of us can take away the sadness you are feeling. I hope it is a comfort to know how much he means to us and how much you mean to us as well. We honor your grace, your own courage, and above all, the great love that you gave to your husband. When these days of ceremony are completed, the nation returns him to you for the final journey to the West. And when he is laid to rest under the Pacific sky, we will be thinking of you as we commend to the Almighty the soul of his faithful servant, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
The U.S. Air Force Singing Sergeants. They've been together since 1945. They all come from within the ranks of the U.S. Air Force Band. And now the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Senator Stevens, who spoke first, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, will place wreaths. And then Vice President Cheney will attend the placing of the presidential wreath. President Bush today, as you know, in Sea Island, Georgia, at a meeting of the industrial nations. He will return to Washington and go directly to the rotunda upon his return to pay his respects. The President's wreath, attended, as we said, by Vice President Cheney. And when the President arrives tomorrow, about 6:30 in the evening, he'll come up here directly to pay his respects, and then he and Mrs. Bush will go across to Blair House, just across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, to visit with Mrs. Reagan. Mrs. Reagan will be staying at Blair House for the week. A Senate chaplain.
O giver of every good and perfect gift, accept our gratitude for the life of your servant, President Ronald Reagan, whose love for freedom summoned our nation to embrace our best hopes and not our worst fears. Thank you for his ability to plant seeds of confidence and not doubt, and to lift liberty's lamp until totalitarian towers tumbled. In the days to come, remind us of America's opportunity to remain a shining city on a hill. Continue to comfort those who mourn. In a special way, be near to Mrs. Nancy Reagan and the family. May the death of this beloved leader prompt us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly day by day. Now fill us with your peace as we trust you, so that we may overflow with hope by the power of your Spirit. Amen.
Michael Reagan, who said of his father after his death, he never harmed a soul in his life. Every branch, every aspect of institutional American life is represented here today. You saw the members of the Supreme Court, members of the President's Cabinet, the current President's Cabinet were there, the Secretary of Defense was there, Vice President was there, the Secretary of State was there as well. Those members of the President's immediate party who were not in Sea Island, Georgia today, talking to the other industrial nations about Iraq, the current President's overseas burden. Members of the Supreme Court were here, I think almost to a man, though I did not see Sandra Day O'Connor. And all the representatives of the armed services, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were here, all the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate who were in town. We know of no one who was particularly absent. The U.S. Army's brass quintet, which concludes, as best we know, the official portion of this day, of this goodbye to President Reagan. And within 45 minutes, as the members of the House and the Senate drift away, members of the public who have been waiting outside will be allowed to come in. The rotunda will stay open throughout the night and throughout tomorrow. And as the official representatives to this do leave this great rotunda, some concluding thoughts perhaps from my colleagues who know the President well, who know the establishment well, and who know, I think, all of them, that as the American historian Gary Wills said, Ronald Reagan was a mirror of America, a man who does not so much argue for American values as embodies them. First of all, Sam Donaldson.
Peter, you know, as I watched the flag-draped casket all day long, moving up Constitution Avenue, this impressive ceremony that we've just seen, one of the aspects of Ronald Reagan's Americanism that I remember so well was the way he honored fallen heroes, just as we honor our former commander-in-chief today. He'd go out to Andrews Air Force Base one June and he pinned medals on the flag-draped coffins of Marines who'd been killed in El Salvador. Went down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He comforted families and honored the dead from the terrible plane crash of troops that come back from the Sinai. Went to Camp Lejeune. Remember when the Marines were blown up in Lebanon? He believed in doing that and doing it publicly. Now, I don't know what Ronald Reagan would say about today's policy of not allowing news coverage of the flag-draped coffins of our heroes from Iraq. I can only tell you what he did.
Thank you, Sam. You remind us all, of course, of the healing capacity that President Reagan had. President Clinton had it as well. We saw it at Oklahoma City, but the families of the Marines who were killed in Lebanon, 240 of them, the families of the astronauts who were killed on board Challenger, in the disaster when the president went to Houston. He had that gift that not every politician has by any means, to seem to comfort on behalf of the nation those individuals who were very often suffering in the public eye. Cokie Roberts.
Well, Peter, not only did he have that sense of connection, but he had a sense of ceremony. And that's, of course, what we're seeing here tonight, is understanding that America needs a ceremony to say farewell to this president. And the place to do that, of course, is this Capitol. When the song God Bless America was playing at the end, I was struck because, of course, on September 11th, after the members evacuated, they came straggling back and stood on the steps and just spontaneously started singing God Bless America. But they came back here to do it because as much as people and politicians, and Ronald Reagan among them, talk about Washington as being some odd inside the Beltway place, it is the place America comes together, and the Capitol of the United States is the central place where that happens. And President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan understood that and brought him back here for America to say goodbye.
We both know, Cokie, that the president's popularity has increased since the time he left office. I think he left with an approval rating somewhere in the mid-50% and ends up the end of his life with something in the mid-70%. I suppose that's not to be unexpected as the president gets distant from some of the controversial policies which people have been talking about in the last day or so.
I think that's, of course, true. We all have fonder memories as we get older. But I think that it's also true that in his later life, his grace seemed to be so evident, as many people have talked about, that special grace that allowed him to write that remarkable letter saying, I have Alzheimer's, goodbye. And the grace that Mrs. Reagan also showed through that very difficult time, I think has endeared both of them to many people who didn't feel particularly dearly about them before that. But also there's whole generations now, Peter, of young people who were born after Ronald Reagan was president who love Ronald Reagan. So he has a legacy that is greater than his presidency.
Many thanks, Cokie. Barbara Walters, the presidency, in the case of Ronald Reagan, cast a very long shadow.
Well, I have two thoughts. One, Peter, you just mentioned Sandra Day O'Connor, and I think a great many people don't realize what Ronald Reagan did for women, because he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman to the Supreme Court, and that was a very, very big thing to do at the time. I guess thinking so often of the days of violence and fear that we're facing now, that this has been a respite, perhaps. It takes us back to a gentler time, to a man who so often put a smile on our face, and to his widow. I mean, she's such a force today as we see her, this woman who exemplifies commitment and devotion and love.
Many thanks, Barbara. We will have some greater sense, I think, of the world on Friday when an undetermined number of international leaders come to pay tribute. This, as we said earlier, a funeral by invitation, but certainly we know that Mikhail Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union, last leader of the Soviet Union, with whom President Reagan forged such a bond, to the surprise of a great many other people in the world, will be here, as will the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. But this letter to which so many people have referred in the last couple of days, this letter to the country about his Alzheimer's, what such a simple letter written in 1994, just simply starting off by saying, I've been told that I'm one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, and he concluded by saying that I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life, and I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead. So even though the future did not at all shine brightly for the president in terms of Alzheimer's, he maintained this particular spirit for America as a whole. Linda Douglas.
Peter, I was thinking as I watched all those members of Congress in that incredible ceremony and watching the former First Lady Nancy Reagan, I was thinking about something that Jerry Brown, who later became the governor of California, said about Reagan, and that is that to be a leader, you have to be able to get people to follow you. And that really was his strength. To be a successful leader, you have to have followers. And if you look around the Congress today, in that room, there were so many people who got into politics and ultimately rose to power because of Ronald Reagan. And it never would have been predicted when he ran for president.
Thanks very much, Linda.
I'm Lisa Patton in the News 2 Storm Center. On Storm Tracker, we have a storm system that has produced a severe thunderstorm warning for southern Wilson County and northern Rutherford County. In this blinking box here, it is moving to the southeast. The warning is in effect until 7:45. Gusty winds, some very heavy rain and thunder and lightning associated with this thunderstorm. We will have updates on this storm and track it for you coming up at 7:30 or as soon as ABC News finishes its coverage. Now back to the coverage.
And apart from them, no one laughed. We're going to return to regular programming, which in some places in a few minutes is going to mean World News Tonight. But we leave you with some other glimpses of the life of the 40th president. I'm Peter Jennings.
As I reflect on my life, I recall the fact that I'm a simple man from modest beginnings. The Reagans of Illinois had little in material terms, but we were emotionally healthy, for we were Americans. Young people in a young land with the best days ahead.
Around it, he's into the clear now. Kaminsky on the 20, the 15, the 10, and Kaminsky is over.
Stop talking, children, and finish your curly Christmas.
Don't you see, Hans?
I think it'd be a little weak.
Where's the rest of me?
This last string. Yeah, but they all had win just one for the Kipper.
In our story tonight, there's a little touch of magic.
Would you consider yourself a leading man?
Rather.
Here's great news about two wonderful Baraxo hand cleaning products. It's another way we live better electrically.
I thought I was a good father. I should have been sterner than I was.
In addition to being married, they were best friends.
He really makes a better friend than a father.
He's kind of a soft touch. He tried.
Mr. Reagan.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Actor Ronald Reagan is elected governor of California.
I'll try very hard.
I am paying for this microphone.
I accept your nomination for the president.
It is in truth a Reagan Republican landslide.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace.
Tragic news from Lebanon. American Marines died this morning.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We kept faith with a promise as old as this land we love and as big as the sky. A brilliant vision of America as a shining city on a hill. Whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, I hope it will record that I appealed to your best hopes, not your worst fears, to your confidence rather than your doubts. Goodbye, and God bless each and every one of you. And God bless this country through love.
This has been an ABC News special report. Farewell to a President.
I'm here at the very location in West Memphis, Arkansas, where Rick Hollifield was hit head-on by a tractor-trailer truck.
My husband Rick had been involved in a serious tractor-trailer accident. Rick's godmother's from Nashville, Tennessee, and she recommended that we call Bart Durham.